Alright guys, so today I'm just going to go through the basic settings of a DSLR camera so that you can shoot better videos straight away. So let's get into the video. So today I'm just going to go through the basic settings you need to know on a DSLR camera. I'm going to go through them with you today, so by the end of this video you should be able to shoot better videos straight off. Now these mugs are here for a reason, that will become more apparent later on in the video. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to want to understand is frame rates. Now I have actually done a video on frame rates that you can find here, but what you basically need to know is your camera will allow you to choose different frame rates for your video. Now most of you will be looking for that cinematic look. It's usually 24 frames per second. Most cameras will shoot in 24 frames per second or 25 frames per second, so either of those will work fine. It depends on if you're shooting in NTSC or PAL. So most of American cameras are PAL, I believe. Most European cameras are NTSC, so they might have slightly different frame rates. But if you shoot in 24 frames per second, then it will give your films that cinematic feel with the right amount of motion blur. The higher the frame rate, the less motion blur you introduce into your image. So the higher the frame rate, the more images are captured per second. So video is just basically a series of images. So if you're shooting 60 frames a second, you're basically taking 60 mini photos in that second to make a moving image. So the higher the frame rate, the smoother the video is going to be, because there'll be more images for that 1 second interval. If you know that you want to turn your footage into slow motion in post, then you want to be shooting in 50 frames per second, 60 frames per second. That way you've got enough frames captured so that when you slow the footage down, it will still be nice and smooth. Again, check out my frame rate video if you want to know a little bit more in-depth information on frame rates and slow motion. And just remember, the higher the frame rates you shoot in, the bigger the files are going to be, because obviously it's going to have to retain more information for that 1 second. So your file sizes will get a little bit bigger. So now we know frame rates: 24 frames per second cinematic, 60 frames per second slow motion. Higher the frame rates, sharper the image, less motion blur. Now the reason 24 frames per second is used in most films is because it's got the right amount of motion blur that's pleasing to the eye. It's not super sharp and it's just more visually pleasing. That's why 24 frames per second is generally used. So the next thing we're going to look at is shutter speed. Now as a rule, your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 48 or usually 50. If you're shooting in 30 frames per second, then it should be 60. 60 frames per second, then 120. So you get the general idea. It should be double the frame rate. What you do want to be careful with shutter speeds is a lot of light frequencies do interfere with shutter speeds. So say in the UK you're shooting at 30 frames per second, then a shutter speed of 60 will interfere with the light frequencies in the UK, so you'll have to knock it down to 50. So the nearer you can get without flicker should be absolutely fine. So moving on to aperture. So the lower the f-stop number or aperture, the more blurred out the background's going to be. The higher the f-stop aperture, the more of the background is going to be in focus. So if you want everything in focus, then you have a high aperture of 10 or above, say. If you want everything in the background to be blurred out and you just want the image in front of your camera to be in focus, which is quite cinematic, get a bit of bokeh, then you would have a low f-stop number, so f1.4, 1.8, something like that. So with the f-stop at 2.8, you can see that the first mug is the only one that's in focus. The other mugs are blurred out. If I move it up to f5.6, and you can see that the first and second mug are in focus, the third mug is still blurred out. And if I move the f-stop all the way up to 16, you can see that all three mugs are pretty much in focus. So if you're outside and you still want to keep your f-stop low so you can keep that blurred background, then you will need to introduce ND filters to the camera, which stops a lot of the light coming in, which means that you can still work with lower f-stops. Because the lower your f-stop is, the more light is introduced into the camera. The higher the f-stop, the less light is introduced to the camera. If you're outside and you're not worried about blurring the background out, you can whack the f-stop right the way up. Everything will be in focus. Won't be as much light coming into the camera, and you'll just get a nice image with everything in focus. But if you want the blurred background, you'll have to introduce an ND filter to take some of that light out. Which brings us to the ISO. So as well as controlling the light with your f-stop, your camera also has something called ISO, which usually doubles in increments. So it starts at 200, 400, 800, 1600. Now this also determines how bright your image is going to be. But some cameras' ISOs introduces a lot of noise, which is the grain into your image if you go past a certain ISO. So I know with the GH5, once you start going past 1600, you do start to get a bit more of a grainier image. The image doesn't look quite so sharp. So you don't want to push the ISO too much on most cameras. Some cameras' ISOs you can push up quite high without introducing any grain, but the GH5, I know that if you go above 1600 you're going to start introducing grain. Now each DSLR will also have what's known as a native ISO, and that means that if you're using that ISO you're going to get the best image possible from the camera. Now on the GH5 it's 400 I believe, so if I'm shooting at 400 ISO I know I'm getting the best image possible from this camera. Now, you're not always going to be able to shoot at your native ISO, depending on lighting, etc. But where you can, if you can shoot with your native ISO, then that's always going to benefit your image. Your camera will also have something called white balance. Now, white balance just basically determines how true your image is. So what you want to do is you want to grab yourself a set of these cards. Now, this set is fairly cheap. They can be really expensive, but if you're just starting out, just grab yourself a fairly inexpensive set of white balance cards. Then all you do is you hold that in front of your camera, take a photo, then your camera will white balance itself with its surroundings so that you get the truest image possible. Now, as you can see from this example, if there's a lot of tungsten light, your image is going to be very yellow. Also, if you're outside or in weird lighting conditions, then your images might look a little bit blue. So you want them to look as close to natural as possible, which is why you use the white balance cards. A lot of cameras have got auto white balance, which is usually pretty good. If I'm in a rush, I tend to use the auto white balance on the GH5. Some cameras are better than others. Now, the last thing I'm going to really talk about is focus. So my advice to you is not to use autofocus, especially when you're starting out. Use manual focus and learn how to focus properly. So choose some objects, a bit like these mugs, and then just try and pull focus between the objects. Practice focusing on one and then the next one, just so you get used to focusing your camera. Don't rely on autofocus. Now, some cameras autofocuses are really good. The GH5 isn't particularly good. The thing with autofocus, especially if you're shooting something for a long time, you don't want it to be hunting for the object, which is where the object goes out of focus and it finds it again to focus on it, because then it does weird stuff with your image. So my advice is try and manually focus when you can, especially when you're starting out, just so you can learn how to focus your lenses properly. So that's it for this one. Once you understand these basics, then you can get started shooting decent video. I haven't gone too much into anything. It was really just to get you started, and hopefully you can progress from here. Now, I'm not going to go into color profiles or anything like that because they're going to be different on each camera, but obviously learn your way around your color profiles as well. So hopefully you found this useful. If you have, please do give it a thumbs up. Help shoot me up the old YouTube algorithm. Leave me a comment below if you have any more questions. I read and reply to every comment. If you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to my channel. I'm releasing content on a Monday and Thursday at the moment. Audio and visual gear reviews, editing tutorials, drone tutorials, all that sort of thing. So it'd be great to have some new faces on board. If you're already subscribed, appreciate you as always. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so I can let you know when new content is released. That's it for this one. Catch you in the next one.